So, real quick, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about South Africa and apartheid. When we talk about South Africa, in the early 1900s, South Africa was run by white Afrikaners. Afrikaners were the original Dutch people that landed in South Africa, and they took the land from the African tribes that lived there. Um, Even though South Africa had received its official independence in 1910 from Great Britain, most of what was going on in South Africa was that it was run by whites, so the Afrikaners and even the British that resided there. So really, truly, Africans, like original black Africans, had restrictions and a lack of freedom in South Africa. The government passed restrictive laws meant to limit the freedoms of non-whites. So non-whites would be black South Africans. So in 1948, there was a height in racial discrimination in South Africa. It was called apartheid. And so if you look at the root word here in apartheid, apart is a big thing. And so what you have to understand is that the Afrikaners, which is spelled with a K, they are the Dutch whites that led this like separatist, segregated movement, and so they created apartheid, which means apartness, and that's in the Afrikaans language. So Afrikaner is spelled with a K, and that's Dutch. The policy divided people into four racial groups: white, black, colored, which colored means that they had mixed ancestry, and Asian, because they were Indians that worked in the salt mines during this time. Apartheid attempted to create a greater separation between non-whites and whites and opposed harsh controls over non-whites. So what you have to understand is like they banned things like interracial marriage. So whites and blacks could not marry, or coloreds could not marry Asians, or any of those groups could not marry each other. So that's a social law. And placed restrictions on black African ownership of land and businesses. So what you have to understand is that the non-whites, the Afrikaners, remained in control of social, political, and economic aspects, and even, changed cultural dynamics in South Africa. These laws were especially harsh on black South Africans, and they were required to carry passes, like identity books, kind of similar to like what we have with passports, which indicated where they could live and where they could work. They had restrictions that they could have imprisonment if the police found them in areas for longer than 72 hours without a pass. Under apartheid, only white South Africans could vote for political office, which means they took away their voting rights for blacks who made up nearly 75% of the population during this time. And so what you have to understand is that many black South Africans could be denied citizenship, and they were restricted to certain occupations, which means they had a criteria of jobs that black South Africans could have, but they were limited and they had limited pay. So the other thing that happened is that the white South Africans, or the Afrikaners, took land from black South Africans, and they restricted where they could live, and they put them in areas called townships, which were, I don't want to say similar to ghettos for the Jews, but it kind of was, because they were a separated group and they had to live in certain areas. And they put them in these areas to make sure that they remained poor. And so a lot of these lands didn't include farmland or good resources for these black South Africans. And they denied them these homelands for a very long time. So what's going to happen is there's going to be a couple of leaders that come about and try to bring nationalism and move away from apartheid. And one of them is going to be Nelson Mandela, who is going to create or be part of the African National Congress. And what he's going to do is that they are going to be a radical group that wants to bring equality to South Africans, and black South Africans, as well as coloreds or mixed, and also the Asians, because they feel like they're being treated unjustly. Nelson Mandela is originally going to be a lawyer in South Africa, and he's going to work for black South Africans to create equality for them. But what's going to ultimately happen is, because of his power, his movement, and his power becoming so popular amongst black South Africans, they will imprison Nelson Mandela for about 27 years. And while he's in prison, they try to kind of, beat and submit, not beat Nelson Mandela physically, but they try to push him away from his movement and to not allow him to, kind of inspire people. So in 1952, Mandela helped organize a campaign to urge blacks in South Africa to break apartheid laws. So he creates or he practices civil disobedience, where he says we need to break some of these laws, and he wanted to have voting rights and social equality and interracial marriage and things like that. So the African National Congress is going to petition the government and held peaceful protests against apartheid. But because Nelson Mandela, had become so popular, they tried to imprison him. But what will ultimately happen is that Nelson Mandela will be released from prison in 1990, and he will eventually become president of the first black South African president in 1994. So make sure that you jot all of this down in your notes and fill in the blanks. If you need to go back, rewind, pause, do whatever you need to do.